The military dog hit the cafeteria at a dead sprint, broke through a crowd of 50 people, ignored every command his handler screamed behind him, and stopped at the wheels of a nurse's chair. A woman nobody in that hospital had ever looked at twice. He didn't bark. He didn't circle. He pressed his entire body across her lap like a wall, like something breathing and certain, and refused to move. His handler was shouting, staff were frozen, visitors had their phones out, and the nurse, quiet, still, hands resting on the dog's back, looked up at the man stumbling toward her and said the 4 words that would unravel everything that followed. "Sit down, right now." If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end. Like this video, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. This is a work of cinematic fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, institutions, locations, and events are wholly invented. The cafeteria at Mercer Valley Medical Center ran long and narrow, built into the east wing of the hospital like an afterthought, which it essentially was. The lighting was the particular yellow of institutional spaces. Not warm, not clinical, just present. The kind of light that made everyone look slightly unwell. It smelled like reheated soup and floor cleaner and the ghost of burnt coffee that had been burning since 6 in the morning. At 11:30 on a Tuesday, the room held maybe 50 people, a cluster of residents near the beverage station arguing about overnight call schedules. 2 nurses from the cardiac unit eating in deliberate silence, a handful of family members staring into their phones, waiting for news that hadn't come, a dietary aide pushing a cart with one squeaky wheel. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary morning. Nora Kelsey wheeled herself to a corner table the way she did every day. Same table, same corner, positioned so her back wasn't to the room. Old habit. She set her tray down with one hand and locked her chair and pulled her coffee toward her without looking up. She'd learned to perform the mechanics of daily routine efficiently and without drama, because any hesitation, any fumble, gave people an excuse to rush over and help, and the helping was always worse than the difficulty. She was 32. Brown hair pulled back in a clip that had seen better days. Eyes the color of creek water, observant without intending to be. She wore her scrubs plain, no decorative badge reel, no stickers on her ID badge, nothing that invited conversation. She had been at Mercer Valley Medical Center for 14 months, assigned to the general medical floor, and in those 14 months she had become the kind of person the hospital absorbed without registering. Not invisible, exactly. Just unremarkable. A nurse in a wheelchair who did her job without complaint and went home and came back the next morning. That was as far as anyone at Mercer Valley knew, the whole story. She was reaching for her fork when the door banged open. The dog came through first. He was a Belgian Malinois, brindle-coated and compact, built like something assembled for a specific purpose. He moved the way working dogs move when they're not performing, fast, low, deliberate. And he covered the distance from the door to the center of the room in about 3 seconds, dragging his leash behind him like a detail he'd forgotten about. His handler was still in the doorway, one hand outstretched, voice already going sharp. "Bravo! Hier!" The dog didn't stop. He cut through the cluster of residents. A woman yelped and pressed herself against the beverage station. A tray went down, plastic against tile, and soup spread across the floor. Phones came out. Someone near the back started to stand. The dietary aide with the squeaky cart pulled it sideways and pressed herself flat against the wall. The dog crossed the cafeteria in a line so direct it looked calculated, and he came to a full stop at the left wheel of Nora's chair. He pressed himself against her legs, all of his weight, deliberate, settled, and he did not move again. Nora put her fork down. She didn't recoil. She didn't grab for her phone. She looked at the dog, noted the way his body was oriented, not toward her but angled back, one eye fixed on the doorway. And she lifted her gaze to the man crossing the room toward them. He was tall. Hard to guess age when someone had been through what he'd clearly been through. Maybe mid-30s, maybe older. He carried himself with the specific posture of someone who had trained their body to project control, even when control was the thing they were most desperately managing. Dark jacket, civilian clothes that didn't quite sit right on him, as though he'd dressed for a role he wasn't comfortable playing. His jaw was tight. His right hand was working, thumb pressing against the side of his index finger, over and over, a grounding technique so practiced it had probably stopped being conscious years ago. His name was Marcus Hale. She didn't know that yet. What she knew, in the 30 seconds since the dog had arrived, was that his handler's breathing was wrong. She could see it from across the room. The expansion of the chest was shallow and uneven. The color around his mouth had gone off. His eyes were moving too fast, tracking too much, and the way he was moving toward her, stiff-legged, jaw-locked, was not the movement of a man who was angry about his dog. It was the movement of a man who was losing the thread. "I'm sorry," he said when he reached her table. His voice was controlled but working at it. He's never done this before. I need him back." He reached for the leash. Bravo pressed harder against Nora's legs and made a sound low in his chest. Not a growl, something more complicated than that. "What's his name?" Nora asked. The man blinked. Whatever he'd expected her to say, it wasn't that. "Bravo." "Okay." She rested her hand on the dog's back, between his shoulder blades, the way you'd place a hand on a person. "Steady. Bravo's going to stay right here for a minute, and you're going to sit down. I don't need to. I know you don't need to." Her voice wasn't soft, and it wasn't hard. It was the voice of someone who had given directions in rooms where nobody wanted to listen. "Sit down anyway." He stared at her. The hand was still working. Thumb, index finger, and his breathing was doing something that was going to go somewhere bad if nothing interrupted it. She could see the moment he ran out of argument. He pulled the chair out from across her table and lowered himself into it with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a body they didn't entirely trust. "Eyes on me," she said. "I'm fine." "You're not. That's okay." "Eyes on me." He looked at her. She held it. "Count with me. Breathe in for 4. She didn't make a production of it, didn't perform calm. She just breathed evenly and waited. 4 counts. In. The cafeteria around them had gone still. Someone had turned off the television in the corner, or maybe nobody had touched it, and she just couldn't hear it anymore. The dietary aid was still flattened against the wall. The residents had stopped talking. A woman near the back had her phone up but seemed uncertain whether she was recording or calling someone. Nora ignored all of it. "Good," she said, though she hadn't counted out loud. She could see his chest. "Hold 2. Out for 6. He was embarrassed. She could see that too. The color climbing his neck, the way his free hand gripped the edge of the table. He was a man who had probably not been embarrassed in this way, in a public room, in a very long time. She didn't acknowledge the embarrassment. Acknowledging it would make it the thing they were managing, and that wasn't what either of them needed right now. 2 minutes, maybe 3. Bravo stayed heavy across her lap, warm and still, and the man across from her gradually stopped looking like he was about to go somewhere that no one in this room could follow him. His breathing evened out, the jaw unclenched. "There you go," Nora said, plain, matter of fact. He let out a breath that had been held too long. "I don't usually—" He stopped, tried again. "That doesn't usually happen in public. Doesn't matter where it happens." He looked at her properly for the first time. She could see him recalibrating, doing the same thing people always did when they finally looked, which was working through what they were seeing and trying to figure out what it meant. The wheelchair, the scrubs, the plainness of her. She'd gotten used to the pause, the reassessment. "You're a nurse," he said. "You knew what was—" He stopped again. "How did you know what to do?" Nora scratched behind Bravo's ear. The dog had relaxed somewhat, but hadn't moved. "I've seen it before," she said, which was true, and told him nothing. A beat of silence. "Marcus Hale," he said. "Nora Kelsey." She picked up her coffee. "You're here visiting someone?" "Appointment." He glanced at Bravo. "He's technically a registered service animal. They're supposed to allow him." The woman at the front desk. He pressed his thumb against his finger again once. There was a disagreement. Nora absorbed this. "He's not your therapy dog," she said. Marcus looked at her. "Posture's all wrong," she said. "He's a working dog. Or was. That's not how therapy animals sit." She nodded slightly at Bravo. He positioned himself between you and the room. That's protection, not comfort response. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed register. Not louder, but different, more careful. He was my MWD, military working dog. 8 years. We got out at the same time. What happened? His eyes moved to the table. IED, 3 years ago, Kandahar province. He said it the way you say coordinates, just information. He caught the shrapnel that was meant for me. They retired him. A small sound, not quite a laugh. They gave me a different kind of paperwork. Nora didn't say she was sorry. She'd learned over many years in many different rooms that sorry was often the thing people said when they wanted the story to stop without having to say so. And the panic episodes. Yeah, he looked at the dog. He started doing this. He made a vague gesture toward the general situation, the broken leash sprint, the cafeteria, the scene they'd apparently been to everyone in the room. He started detecting them before I knew they were coming, before I felt anything. That's not unusual. Dogs read cortisol. They told me that. At the VA. Are you getting support? He looked at her again. She could see him deciding whether to be offended by the directness. He decided not to be. Some. The program here is... He exhaled. I had an appointment upstairs. You should keep it. I know. Bravo finally shifted. He stepped off Nora's lap, deliberately, as though releasing something he'd been holding, and settled on the floor beside Marcus's chair. Marcus reached down and touched the dog's head with a hand that had finally stopped working itself. Around them, the cafeteria was slowly returning to its ordinary frequency. The residents had turned back to their argument. Someone had cleaned up the dropped soup. The dietary aide was pushing her squeaky cart again. The woman with the phone had put it away. Nora finished her coffee. She had 12 minutes before her shift resumed on the medical floor. Bravo knew before you did, she said. He always does. Marcus looked at the dog with something complicated in his face, gratitude and something that sat right next to it, uncomfortable. That's the thing I can't get used to, being the one who needs the warning. Nora set her mug down. If you were still operational, she said carefully, and a soldier in your unit was struggling, what would you think of them? He considered the question seriously, which she'd expected. These were people who didn't do rhetorical. I'd want to get them the help they needed. That's your job. You don't leave it... He stopped. She watched him arrive at it. Yeah, she said, and let it sit there. He was quiet a moment longer, then he said, You don't look like you've always been a nurse in a general ward. She didn't answer that. He looked at her chair. Not with pity, she would have clocked pity immediately, 12 years of practice, but with the recognition of someone reading a situation the way they'd been trained to. What happened? Deployment. She picked up her tray. 2 tours. The second one didn't end the way the first one did. She said it with the same flatness she used for everything else. Just coordinates, just information. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, which branch? Army. MOS. She looked at him, held it a half-second longer than necessary. 68 whiskey. Combat medic. He nodded and she could see him recalculating again. Not just what he was seeing, but what he'd been looking at the whole time without knowing it. She set her tray on the cart near the door. Keep your appointment, she said without turning back. Bravo went to a lot of trouble to get you here. The medical floor on the 3rd level of Mercer Valley was shaped like a backward L, with the nursing station at the crook and 2 long corridors running out from it in different directions. The east corridor held the higher acuity patients. The west was step down, recovery, the ones who were getting better but not quite ready to go home. Nora worked both. The charge nurse that afternoon was a woman named Patricia Dowd, who had been at Mercer Valley for 22 years and had calcified certain opinions the way old wood calcifies, dense, immovable, and completely indifferent to whether the opinions were still useful. She tolerated Nora in the specific way that people tolerate things they've decided not to understand. Professionally courteous. Eyes that skip the chair without quite landing on it. At 12:15, Nora was completing a medication reconciliation for a patient in room 312 when Dowd stopped in the doorway. Kelsey, Nora looked up. There's a note in your file from administration. Dowd had her hands at her sides, not a clipboard, not a chart. This wasn't a clinical conversation. They're restructuring the floor assignments next quarter. You're being moved to outpatient intake. Nora kept her expression neutral. I wasn't informed. They're informing you now. Outpatient intake is... She stopped. It wasn't necessary to say what outpatient intake was. They both knew. Paperwork, scheduling, vitals on ambulatory patients. The kind of work assigned to nurses who someone needed to keep busy and out of the way. I have the highest patient satisfaction scores on this floor for the last 2 quarters. I know that. And the lowest medication error rate. I know that too. Neither of them said what was underneath it. They'd done this before, not this exact conversation, but versions of it. Every time Nora put in for a committee, every time she'd flagged a protocol gap and had her flag quietly unflagged, every time there was a development opportunity that materialized somewhere just above the level of where she'd been told she was suited to work. Who made the decision? Nora asked. Dowd's expression shifted, half a degree, in the direction of something that might have been discomfort. Director Callum. Harlan Callum. Medical director of Mercer Valley for the past 6 years. Nora had spoken to him twice, once during her hiring interview, once in a hallway when she'd questioned a staffing decision in front of him and 2 department heads. He'd looked at her chair both times before he'd looked at her face. Is there an appeal process? She asked. You'd have to take it to HR, which meant nothing would happen, and they both knew it. And one of them was fine with that, and one of them wasn't. Dowd left. Nora completed the medication reconciliation because the patient in 312 still needed it done, and the situation in 312 hadn't changed just because the situation outside it had. Yasat. She found out later from a dietary aide who talked freely and couldn't help it that Marcus Hale had made it to his appointment, that Bravo had been allowed up in the elevator, that the appointment had lasted an hour and 40 minutes, longer than scheduled, and that when Marcus came back through the lobby, he looked like someone who'd set something down he'd been carrying for a long time. Nora heard this third hand, over coffee, and filed it where she filed most things, quietly, without comment. She didn't expect to see him again. The next 10 days moved the way hospital days move, which is to say, cyclically and without mercy. There were patients who got better and patients who didn't. There were families who asked good questions and families who asked the same question repeatedly in hopes of a different answer. There were shifts that ended with Nora's shoulders locked up to her ears and shifts that ended with the specific exhaustion that comes from caring about people for 10 hours straight. She filed the HR appeal regarding outpatient intake. She was told it was under review. She knew what that meant. On the 11th day, she was in the corridor outside the West Wing when she heard footsteps coming from the stairwell, the particular pattern of a large dog on a hard floor, nails hitting tile in a deliberate 4-beat rhythm. Bravo came around the corner first. His tail moved when he saw her, not the manic wag of a pet, but a controlled acknowledgement. Marcus was behind him, and he looked better. Not well. That wasn't a word she'd use, and she doubted he'd be comfortable with it yet, but present. Steadier than the man who'd been losing the thread in the cafeteria 11 days ago. Hey, he said. Hey. She looked at Bravo. He dragged you back here? Appointments weekly now. He said it without embarrassment this time, like information. I wanted to, He paused, trying to figure out how to say something. I wanted to say thank you for the other day. You did the work. You stopped me from leaving. She had, technically. She didn't argue it. How are the sessions going? He shrugged, but not the way people shrug to close a conversation. The way they shrug when something is actually complicated and they're choosing honesty. Hard. Worth it, I think. He looked down at Bravo. He still does it. The detection. I'm starting to recognize when he's reading something I haven't registered yet. That's good. It's disorienting. That's also good. Disorienting means something's shifting. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the cafeteria, recalibrating. You talk like someone who's been in a chair with someone doing the same work. I did a lot of things before this job, she said. He didn't push it. She'd noticed that about him. He asked direct questions, but he didn't excavate. There was something soldierly in that. You asked what you needed to know for the current situation, and you left the rest. They stood in the corridor for a moment, Bravo between them, perfectly still, and then Nora's pager went off. I have to go, she said. Yeah. He stepped back. Then, as she was moving, Kelsey. She stopped. That thing you said. About the soldier in your unit. He looked at her. I didn't leave it. She held his gaze for a moment. Neither did I. She wheeled herself toward the east wing without looking back, and behind her, she heard Bravo's nails hitting the tile in that 4-beat rhythm, steady and deliberate, the sound of something still working. The morning of the 14th was the kind that starts wrong and doesn't correct. Nora was in the middle of a handoff briefing when she was paged not to the floor, but to administration, second level, north end, the offices that overlooked the main entrance and smelled like carpet that had been cleaned too many times. She got there at 8:47, and Harlan Callum's assistant, a small, precise man named Grover, who seemed deeply uncomfortable about something, showed her into the outer office and closed the door. She waited 11 minutes. Callum came in from the interior hallway, and he didn't sit down, which told her everything about how long this was intended to take. Harlan Callum was 58, built like a man who had once been athletic and had made peace with no longer being athletic. He wore his authority the way some men wear expensive watches, visibly at all times, in the specific hope that you noticed. He had a broad, flat face and eyes that moved fast and landed slow, which was a particular kind of intelligence that Nora had learned to be cautious around. The appeal was reviewed, he said. I assume that's what this was about. The decision stands, outpatient intake effective the 1st of next month. Mr. Callum? Dr. Callum. She didn't flinch. Dr. Callum. If there's a documented performance basis for this transfer, I'd like to see it. It's a restructuring decision. Performance isn't the criteria. My performance reviews are the strongest on the floor. The restructuring isn't about individual performance. They were not going to agree on this because there was nothing to agree on. He had made a decision, and he was using language that made the decision look like a process, which was different from it being a process. I want this documented, she said, in writing. The reason for the transfer and the review outcome. Something moved across his face. Not anger, which she'd expected, but something more deliberate than anger. Like he'd already anticipated this and had an answer ready. Grover can give you a copy of the review summary. I want the full documentation. The summary is what's available to staff. Nora held his gaze for a count of 3. She was aware of her position in the chair and of his position standing, and she was aware that he was aware of it too, that he had arranged this, had chosen not to offer a seat, had set up the geometry of the room to mean something. She'd seen it before. She understood what it was supposed to accomplish. It didn't accomplish it. Thank you for your time, she said, and left. The morning broke open at 10:42. She was at the nursing station with a chart when the announcement came, not over the general PA, because whatever was happening was being kept quiet, but through the rapid, targeted movement of specific staff. She saw 2 senior physicians almost jogging toward the South Conference Suite, which wasn't a clinical space. She saw Callum's assistant, Grover, moving through the corridor with a face that had drained of all its ordinary color. She stopped a passing nurse aide. What's happening? Guest. VIP, I think. In the South Suite. Someone's down. The South Conference Suite was 3 corridors away. Nora was already moving. She heard the commotion before she reached it, voices overlapping, the specific elevated register of people who are trying to project competence in the presence of something they're not prepared for. She came around the corner and found a cluster of staff in the hallway outside the suite's double doors, including Dr. Voss from cardiology, who was on his phone, and a woman in a hospital administrator's blazer who appeared to be doing nothing useful at considerable speed. Through the open doors, Nora could see the man on the floor. He was heavy-set, mid-60s, in the kind of suit that cost what Nora made in a month. He was conscious, but deteriorating. She could see it from where she was. The gray around his mouth, the shallow, irregular breathing, the way his hand was moving without purpose. She rolled toward the door. Stop! Callum stepped into her path from somewhere to her left. His voice was low, but very clear. This doesn't involve you, Kelsey. That man needs... Dr. Voss is handling it. Voss is on the phone. You are a floor nurse in an administrative suite. You are not called, and you are not needed. She looked past him at the man on the floor. His breathing had changed in the 30 seconds since she'd arrived. It was faster now, shallower. The trend line was obvious, and the trend line was bad. Dr. Callum. Her voice was very quiet. That man is going to code in the next 4 minutes if nobody does something that Voss isn't doing. Do not make me call security. Everything in the room was sharp-edged and very clear. She could feel it, the specific quality of a moment that is happening once and will not repeat, that will finish one way or another and will not ask what she preferred. She rolled past Harlan Callum and through the open doors. She heard him behind her, voice rising, the specific register of a man who has given an order and cannot believe it's being ignored. But she was already across the room, already kneeling the chair forward, already reading what she was looking at with eyes that had been trained not in a medical school classroom, but in a forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan, with casualties coming in on whatever transport was available. The man on the floor looked up at her. His eyes were frightened and very clear. I've got you, she said. What medications are you on? He got out 3 words before the next wave hit him. It was enough. Marcus was in the waiting area outside the behavioral health suite on the 4th floor when Bravo went rigid. Not slowly, not incrementally. The dog went from relaxed to absolute stillness the way a circuit trips, instantaneous and total. He was on his feet before Marcus had fully registered the shift, pressing against his legs, staring at the elevator doors. Marcus put his hand on Bravo's head. Easy, he said, but his own pulse was doing something he didn't like, and he wasn't sure anymore whether it was him or whether it was the dog translating something he hadn't received yet. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. From a number he didn't recognize. South Conference Suite. Come now. He was at the elevator in 4 steps, Bravo tight at his heel, and it wasn't until the doors were closing that he realized he hadn't thought about whether to go. He had just gone. And somewhere 3 floors below him, in a room full of people who had spent the last month deciding exactly what she was worth, Nora Kelsey was proving them catastrophically wrong. The man's name was Gerald Fitch, and he was dying in the specific way that men who believe they are too important to die tend to die, suddenly, and with an expression of genuine offense. Nora had gotten 3 words out of him before the second wave hit: blood thinner, heart, and a number that was either a dosage or a blood pressure reading from his last appointment, and she was operating on the assumption that it was both. She had his pulse in her fingers before the echo of Callum's voice had finished bouncing off the conference suite walls behind her, and what she felt told her the 3 words were enough. Atrial fibrillation, rapid ventricular response, not a full arrest, not yet, but the heart was throwing its rhythm the way a drunk throws punches, fast, disorganized, increasingly dangerous. Does anyone in this room have an AED location? She said it without turning around. Loud enough to carry, not loud enough to sound like panic, because panic was what they already had, and what this room needed was the opposite. Silence from the doorway, then a voice she didn't recognize. Down the hall, east corridor, the red cabinet. Get it. She didn't know who she was talking to, and it didn't matter. Somebody call a crash cart up from the 2nd floor. Now, not in 5 minutes. Gerald Fitch's hand found her wrist. His grip was weak, and his eyes were very wide, and he was doing the thing people do when they are frightened and want to be told that the person helping them knows what they're doing. She held his gaze. I have you, she said. Stay with me. Don't close your eyes. Behind her she heard Callum's voice, lower now, recalibrated, the specific register of a man managing how this was going to look, rather than managing what was actually happening. Someone call doctor. Voss back in. Voss was still on his phone in the hallway. She'd seen him. She had no idea who he'd been calling, but it hadn't been relevant to what was happening on the floor in the suite, and it still wasn't. Voss isn't going to get here in time to matter, she said. She wasn't saying it to be cruel, and she wasn't saying it to make a point. She was saying it because it was operationally true, and the room needed to be operating on true information. I need someone to get behind him and keep his airway clear, not tilt his head back, just support it. Who in here has done any first aid? A pause. Then a man in a gray blazer, One of the conference attendees, she guessed, not hospital staff, stepped forward. His face was pale, but his jaw was set. I did a CERT course 3 years ago. That's enough. Come here. Kneel behind his head. Hold it like this. She showed him with her hands. Don't move it once you're there. He did what she said. The AED came through the door 40 seconds later, carried by a young hospital aide who looked like she was holding a live animal. Nora took it, cracked it open one-handed, and had the pads positioned in the time it took for the machine to run its analysis cycle. She was aware, distantly, like awareness of weather, that there were a dozen people watching her from the doorway. She was aware of Callum somewhere to her left, doing the calculation of what this cost him and what stopping it would cost him more. The machine spoke its verdict in the flat tone of something designed to be heard over chaos. The room was already quiet enough that it landed like a word in a library. No shock advised. Continue monitoring. Gerald Fitch's pulse shifted under her fingers. Not resolved, not stable, but the worst of the rhythm disturbance pulling back from the edge it had been moving toward. She felt it happen. The gray around his mouth began to change. Okay, she said quietly, and she wasn't sure if she was talking to him or to herself. Probably both. The crash cart arrived 60 seconds later. The 2 nurses who brought it looked at the scene. Gerald Fitch on the floor, Nora beside him, the CERT-trained man in the gray blazer holding his head, the AED open and active. And one of them said, very flatly, "What do you need?" 12 lead ready, and I want a line in before we move him. She looked at the nurse who'd spoken, young, maybe 2 years out of school, but her hands were steady. You comfortable with that? Yes? Good. Let's go. Dr. Voss came through the door at the 6-minute mark. He took in the situation in stages. Gerald Fitch, now with a line in his arm and leads on his chest, color returning, breathing slower and less desperate. Nora at his side, reading the rhythm strip that was printing from the portable monitor. The crash cart open, organized, partially used. Voss looked at Callum. Callum looked at Nora. She was reading the strip. She did not look up. He's out of immediate danger, she said. Rhythm's irregular, but the rapid ventricular response is coming down. He needs cardiology consult, and he needs it in the next hour, not the next 4. He's going to need a blood draw, and I want to know what his INR looks like before anyone makes a decision about medication management. Voss said, I'll take it from here. I know. She handed him the strip. He told me blood thinner and heart. Whatever he's on for anticoagulation, check the level before you do anything else. I'm aware of... He also said a number. I think it was his last systolic. It was high. He minimized it. She finally looked up, directly at Voss. He's the kind of man who minimizes. Voss took the strip. He looked at it for 2 seconds. Something in his face shifted. The particular shift of a physician reading something that confirms an assessment he might not have made on his own in time. He didn't say anything. He crouched beside Gerald Fitch and began his own assessment. Nora backed her chair slightly away from the radius. There was nothing more to do here that someone else couldn't do. The immediate window was closed. She'd done what the window required. She became aware, in the relative quiet after the crisis, of exactly how many people were in the doorway watching her. Callum found her in the corridor outside the suite 15 minutes later. He didn't come at her loudly. That, she had learned about him in their limited interactions, was not his method. He was a man who preferred to deliver his points at a conversational register, the implication being that whatever he was saying was so obvious it didn't require volume. What you did in there, he said, walking beside her, which required him to slow his pace to match hers, which she suspected he resented, was a significant violation of protocol. A patient was in distress. You were not the responding physician. You were not called. You intervened in a situation that was outside your scope and your assignment, and you did it after I had explicitly directed you to stop. He's alive. That is not the point. She stopped and looked at him. What is the point, Doctor? Callum? The point, he said, quietly, and without breaking eye contact, is that Mercer Valley has standards and chains of authority that exist for reasons you may not fully appreciate. The point is that a floor nurse, regardless of what she thinks she's capable of, does not override a medical director in a room full of hospital guests and external stakeholders. The point is that you created a significant liability situation by acting without authorization, and that situation is going to require management. She let him finish. She'd learned that too, letting people finish, because the completeness of what they said told you more than the interruption ever would. Gerald Fitch would have coded, she said, in approximately 3 to 4 more minutes, based on what I was reading, in that room with the information I had. He did not code. He is currently in cardiology receiving appropriate treatment. She held his gaze. If there's a liability conversation to have after that, I'll have it. She started moving again. Kelsey. His voice had dropped half a register, a different kind of quiet. You're making this very difficult for yourself. She didn't stop. I know. Mitt. Marcus was waiting in the lobby when she came down. He was standing rather than sitting, which told her Bravo had been restless, and the dog confirmed it by moving toward her immediately. Not the sprint of the cafeteria, but a direct, purposeful approach, nose dropping to the wheels of her chair and then rising to her hands. What happened? Marcus said. She looked up at him. He had the look of someone who'd been told secondhand about something significant and wasn't happy about the secondhand. Someone collapsed in a conference suite. I was nearby. That's not what the aide in the lobby told me. What did the aide in the lobby tell you? She said a nurse in a wheelchair kept a man from coding by herself while the doctors stood in the hallway. That's more dramatic than it was. Is it? She reached down and scratched Bravo's ear. The dog pressed into her hand, and she noticed that he was tracking Marcus peripherally, doing the monitoring thing without making it the focus. The man is stable. That's what matters. Marcus sat down on the edge of one of the lobby chairs, elbows on his knees. He had a way of making himself compact when he was processing, taking up less space, as though he was conserving something. Did you get any trouble for it? She looked at him. Right, he said. It's not your problem. I know that. He said it straightforwardly, not defensively. I'm asking anyway. The lobby hummed around them, the main desk, the automatic doors cycling open and closed for foot traffic, someone's visitor badge printing, the ordinary friction of a working hospital. Callum is going to write it up, she said. Whatever he writes, it goes in my file. There are probably grounds for a formal complaint. I ignored a direct order in a room with witnesses. He'll use it. She said it plainly. This is how it goes. You saved the man's life. And I stepped over the medical director to do it. Both things are true. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. There was something forming in his expression, something that wasn't pity and wasn't admiration and was more complicated than either. Who was the patient? She hesitated. Not because she didn't know. She'd seen the badge, the itinerary that had been sitting on the conference table, the names of the meeting attendees printed on a placard, but because she was still working out what the name meant in the context of what she'd just been through. Gerald Fitch, she said. He's a contractor. Defense sector, I think. There was a placard on the table, something about facility procurement. Marcus went very still. It was the kind of stillness she'd learned to recognize in the past 2 weeks. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of someone who has just received information that rearranges something. Gerald Fitch, he said again. You know him. He looked at the floor. He looked at Bravo. He ran a hand across the back of his neck. A gesture she'd learned was his particular version of buying time while he decided what to say. He does procurement contracts for federal facilities, including military medical facilities. She waited. There's been some talk, Marcus said carefully, at the VA, about contracts that got approved that shouldn't have, supplies that were invoiced but didn't show, equipment that got logged as delivered and wasn't. He looked up. I don't know the specifics, I just know what people say in waiting rooms. She absorbed this. What would a defense contractor be doing at Mercer Valley, she said. Not rhetorical, actually asking. I don't know. He said it like he meant it, but she could see him thinking past it. But Mercer Valley has federal patient contracts, veterans from the regional intake program. There's a wing, East Wing, second floor, the federal contract beds. Yeah. He looked at her directly. Did Callum know he was coming in? She thought about the South Conference suite, the way the room had been set, formal, catered, the kind of arrangement that doesn't happen without notice, the way Callum had been in the corridor outside before Gerald Fitch had gone down, the way Grover had already been drained of color when she'd passed him in the hallway earlier that morning. Yes, she said. He knew. They sat with that for a moment. Okay, Marcus said finally. He stood up. He straightened his jacket with the particular precision of someone who had spent years in uniform and still couldn't entirely break the habit. I want to tell you something, and I don't want you to argue with me while I'm saying it. She looked at him. I've been in a lot of different situations, he said, where the person who was right got crushed because they were right in a room where right didn't matter. And I have never once, not once, been glad I let that happen. He held her gaze. You're going to need someone to say what they saw in that room today. I was on the 4th floor. I didn't see anything. He paused. But I know people who were in that lobby who did. She started to say it wasn't his problem again. Kelsey. She stopped. Let me do something, he said. Just this one thing. She looked at him for a long moment. Bravo was sitting between them, perfectly still, watching them both with the even attention of something that had learned patience from the job. She thought about the 14 months, the charts she'd flagged and had unflagged, the committee applications that had gone nowhere, the appeal that was under review in a drawer somewhere, the way Callum had looked at her chair before he'd looked at her face. Fine, she said. One thing. What? The next 2 days were the particular quiet that precedes something. She went to work. She did her job. She cared for her patients with the same attention she always had. And she did not speak to administration, and administration did not speak to her, which meant they were preparing something rather than nothing. On the second afternoon, she got a call from the hospital's compliance office. Not Callum, not HR, but compliance specifically, which was different enough from the expected sequence that she sat with it for a full minute before she understood what it meant. They were not just writing it up, they were building something. She called the number Marcus had given her. He picked up on the second ring. I know, he said. I heard. How? One of the guys at the regional VA. He has a contact who does records review for the federal contract beds. There's been activity in the files, Fitch-related procurement documents. Someone's been moving things. His voice was careful and even. Not just recently, going back 2 years. She felt the shape of it before she could see all of it, the way you feel the weight of something in the dark before your eyes adjust. Moving things how? Invoices approved for equipment that doesn't appear in inventory. Supply orders with delivery confirmations, but no corresponding intake records at the facilities. He paused. Fitch's company was the vendor on most of them. And Callum? Another pause, longer. What do you know? She said. I don't know anything, Marcus said. I know what I've been told by people who are looking at records. What I know for certain is that Fitch was at Mercer Valley for a meeting that nobody put on the official calendar. And I know that your medical director made a very specific choice about who was allowed near that man when he went down. She stared at the wall opposite her, the specific administrative yellow of it, the framed photograph of Mercer Valley's founder that nobody had ever looked at. He didn't want me in that room, she said, because he didn't know what I'd hear or see. That's my guess. But I was already there. Yeah, Marcus said. You were. She thought about Gerald Fitch's hand on her wrist, the 3 words, the way his eyes had been clear even when everything else was going wrong. He knew what was happening to him, she said. He wasn't confused. He was scared, but he was cogent. She paused. He said something else. After the blood thinner and the heart. I thought it was the dosage number, but... She stopped. She turned it over. It had been 7 digits. She'd filed it as a blood pressure reading from his last appointment, and she'd moved on because the immediate situation hadn't required it to be anything else. But blood pressure readings were 4 or 5 digits at most, and she'd read enough of them to know the difference without consciously processing it. 7 digits. Marcus, she said, I think he gave me a number. A long silence. What kind of number? He said. I don't know yet.
Can you write it down? She already had. She'd written everything down the moment she'd had a free hand, the way she'd been trained to do in the field, every detail immediately before the adrenaline washed it. She pulled out her notebook. The handwriting was cramped and slightly uneven from writing in motion, but it was there. 7 digits. The number Gerald Fitch had pressed into the noise of a deteriorating situation. She read it to Marcus. He went quiet for so long she thought the call had dropped. "Marcus, I need to make a call," he said. His voice had shifted, gone flat in a way she recognized as someone moving from civilian to operational register, collapsing the distance between the two. "Don't write that number anywhere electronic." "What is it?" "I'll tell you when I know for sure." A brief pause. "Don't go to Callum."
Don't go to HR. Don't go anywhere in that building until I call you back. She looked at the 7 digits on the page. "How long?" she said. "A few hours." And then quieter. "You still trust Bravo's read on things?" It was an odd question. She thought about it for a second. The cafeteria, the dog's weight across her lap, the certainty of it. "Yes," she said. "Good. So do I." He exhaled. "Sit tight, Kelsey." The call ended. She sat in the quiet of her apartment and looked at the number. And somewhere across the city, Marcus Hale was making a call that would either confirm what she was beginning to understand or collapse the whole thing into coincidence. She did not believe in coincidence the way she'd stopped believing in a lot of things. Not cynically, not bitterly, just practically. The field had been an efficient teacher on that particular subject. Her phone buzzed on the table. Not Marcus. A number she didn't recognize, different from the one that had texted her 2 weeks ago in the hospital, but carrying the same quality of a message sent by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had made a careful decision to do it. The text was 4 words. "They're coming for you." She stared at it for 3 seconds. Then she looked up at her door, the lock, the chain, the entirely ordinary apartment she lived in, and thought about the 7 digits and what they might mean, and about Gerald Fitch's hand on her wrist, and about the specific way Harlan Callum had said you are making this very difficult for yourself in a corridor where no one but her had heard it. Her chair was by the window. The evening light was the long, flat gold of a Colorado summer, coming through at an angle that lit the dust in the air and made the ordinary room look momentarily like something else. She picked up her notebook. She wrote down the text, the number it came from, and the time. Then she waited. The second text came 40 minutes after the first. Same number. 3 words this time. Leave the notebook. She didn't leave the notebook. She photographed every page she'd written on since Gerald Fitch's hand had found her wrist in the conference suite, emailed the images to an address she hadn't used in 4 years, a personal account with a password she'd never written down. And then she sat in her apartment and thought about what kind of person sends a warning and then sends a follow-up that sounds like a threat, and whether those were the same person or 2 different people, and what the difference would mean. Marcus called it 947. "The number is a case file identifier," he said without preamble. "Federal. Office of Inspector General, Department of Defense." She had been sitting in the dark. She hadn't turned a light on and hadn't noticed until right now. "Fitch opened a case?" "No, someone opened a case on Fitch 2 years ago." His voice was careful and even, the way it got when he was operating on information he hadn't fully processed yet. "The case number is active, which means the investigation is active." "He gave me a live case number." "While he was going into an arrhythmia on a conference room floor, yes." A pause. "He knew. He knew who you were. Or he figured it out fast enough. He gave you the number because he wanted someone outside the room to have it." She thought about the way he'd looked at her, frightened and clear, both things at once. "He's a witness," she said. "I think he's been trying to be. I think something went wrong." Marcus exhaled. "My contact, the one who does records review, he says Fitch's company started cooperating with investigators 8 months ago, quietly. Then 3 months ago, the cooperation went cold. Fitch stopped returning calls. The file went into a holding pattern. Because someone got to him. Or scared him badly enough that he stopped. Yeah." She turned this over in the dark of her apartment. "And then he ends up at Mercer Valley for a meeting that's not on the official calendar with my medical director, and he collapses." and gives a federal case number to the only person in the room who wasn't affiliated with the hospital or with his company. The dust had settled from the evening light. The room was just dark now. Someone's been watching the investigation. If they knew he was talking to federal investigators, they'd want to know what he said. And to who? "The text tonight," she said. "Someone knows I was in that room." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Are you somewhere safe?" "I'm home." "Stay there." He said it flatly, not urgently, the register of someone giving an instruction they expect to be followed. "Don't go in tomorrow." "I can't just—" "Kelsey," his voice shifted, not softer, more direct. "They already had grounds to build a case against you with the Callum incident. If they're watching what happened in that suite and they know you have information, they're going to move fast and they're going to move through the hospital infrastructure, HR, compliance, licensing board if they can. That's how this works." She knew how it worked. She'd seen it work that way before. Not to her, but close enough that the mechanics were familiar. "They'll revoke my clinical privileges. Or suspend them pending review. Either way, you're out of the building and they control the narrative." She stared at the window. Colorado dark outside, the particular density of summer dark that was never fully black. "What do I do with the case number?" "I'm working on that." A pause. "There's someone I know, someone I served with. He's not active anymore, but he has contacts in the right places. I'm trying to reach him tonight." "Marcus." "Yeah." "The 7 digits. Fitch gave them to me specifically." She said it carefully. "He looked right at me, and he gave them to me. He knew what he was doing." "I know." "Which means he knew who I was before I walked into that room." A longer pause this time. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had changed register again, the way it did when he was fitting pieces together and didn't like the shape they were making. "Or he knew what you were. Former military, medical, someone outside the administrative chain." She absorbed that. "Either way," she said, "he was trying to hand this off, and now he's in cardiology and I'm the one holding it." "Yeah." Marcus's voice was quiet. "You are." She didn't sleep much. She didn't expect to. By 6 in the morning, she had made 3 decisions. The first was to go in. Not because Marcus was wrong about the risk. He wasn't. But because staying out was conceding the narrative before anyone had made a move, and she had spent 14 months refusing to concede narratives to Harlan Callum. The second was to secure the notebook. She drove to a copy center that opened at 6 and made 2 additional copies, left one with a neighbor she trusted, mailed the other to an address she did not write down anywhere digital. The third decision she made while watching the copy machine run, in the flat morning light of an otherwise empty shop. She had spent 4 years being careful about what she disclosed and to whom, and being careful had not kept her on the floor she belonged on or off the outpatient intake list, or out of Callum's office. Careful had kept her quiet and small and very, very easy to move around. She was done being easy to move. At 7:53, she walked onto the medical floor and started her shift. Callum's move came at 10:15. She was in the East Corridor when Patricia Dowd appeared at the nursing station with an expression that had the particular quality of a woman delivering a message she'd been told to deliver and did not enjoy. Beside Dowd was a man Nora hadn't seen before. Mid-40s, lanyard, the deliberate blankness of someone from compliance or legal who had learned not to carry his work in his face. "Kelsey," Dowd said, "you need to come to the station." The man with the lanyard introduced himself as Kevin Pruitt, hospital compliance officer. He had a folder. He set it on the nursing station counter with the careful placement of someone who wanted it noticed. "We're initiating a formal review of the incident in the South Conference Suite on Tuesday. Pending the outcome of the review, your clinical privileges at Mercer Valley are being suspended effective immediately." Nora looked at the folder. "What are the specific grounds?" "Unauthorized clinical intervention, insubordination during an active patient situation, potential violation of scope of practice." Pruitt said it without inflection, which meant he'd said it before, in other rooms to other people, and had learned that inflection made things harder. "You'll need to surrender your badge and key card. Your personal items will be boxed and held at reception." The corridor was not empty. 3 nurses within earshot had stopped moving. The dietary aide with the squeaky cart had stopped at the far end of the hall. Nora did not look at any of them. She looked at Pruitt. I want a copy of the full review documentation, not a summary, the complete file. You'll receive documentation through the formal review process. I'm asking for it now. That's not... I'm asking, she said, so that the request is on record. Today's date, 10:17 a.m., I requested the complete documentation of the grounds for suspension. She held his gaze. You can note that however you'd like. Pruitt's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. He closed the folder. Your badge, Ms. Kelsey. She unclipped it, set it on the counter, removed the key card from her lanyard and placed it beside the badge. She did not look at Patricia Dowd, who had, she thought, the decency at least to look at the floor. She wheeled herself toward the elevator without another word. The corridor was quiet enough that she could hear the dietary aide's cart, that one squeaky wheel, the sound she'd been hearing for 14 months, and then the elevator doors opening, and then nothing. Marcus was outside in his truck when she came through the main entrance. He had not been there when she'd arrived this morning. She stopped on the ramp and looked at him and did not ask how he'd known. Bravo was in the back seat with his nose pressed to the cracked window. He made the low sound when he saw her, the one that wasn't quite a greeting and wasn't quite a check-in, but was somewhere functional between the two. Marcus got out. He didn't say anything about the badge missing from her lanyard or the way she was carrying herself, which was the same as always and therefore told him something. They moved fast, he said. Yes. My contact came through. He said it carefully, the way he said things when the information was significant and he hadn't finished processing it himself. The case is real. Active federal investigation under the DODOIG. Fitch's company was the primary vendor on a supply chain fraud that's been running for at least 3 years. Military medical facilities in 4 states, including the federal contract beds at Mercer Valley. He paused. Callum's name is in the file. She felt the shape of it complete itself. The procurements, the uninvoiced supplies, the meeting that wasn't on the official calendar, the man who'd had a meeting with her medical director and then collapsed while his heart threw itself into a rhythm that was going to kill him. Callum knew he was cooperating, she said, or suspected. My contact thinks the meeting Tuesday was Callum trying to assess where Fitch stood, whether he was still a risk. Marcus's jaw was tight. And then Fitch went down in the room, and you went in, and now there's a witness who has a federal case number who is not affiliated with the hospital and who they cannot easily discredit. They can suspend my license. They can try. He looked at her. That's why I needed last night. My contact, he made a call this morning to the actual investigators. He stopped. They want to talk to you. She looked at him. Federal investigators, he said. DODOIG. Today, if you're willing. She thought about the notebook page she'd photographed and emailed, the number Gerald Fitch had pressed into the noise of his own emergency, the way Callum had looked at her in the corridor, not just angry, but calculating, and the calculation had included something that looked, now that she understood more of the shape, like fear. Where? She said. There's an office. 20 minutes from here. They've been running a satellite operation out of a regional building, keeping it separate from anything connected to the hospital or the VA network. He paused. I'll drive. She looked at Mercer Valley's entrance, the automatic doors, the directory sign, the framed mission statement she'd read exactly once and never thought about since. I need the notebook, she said. The original. You still have it? In my bag. She hadn't surrendered her personal bag. They hadn't asked for it. Then we go. He held the passenger door. Bravo's been waiting. She transferred, folded the chair into the back with a practiced efficiency that she'd long since stopped thinking about, and Bravo immediately leaned forward from the back seat and pressed his nose against her shoulder. She let him. Marcus pulled out of the parking lot and onto the road, and Mercer Valley Medical Center got smaller in the passenger mirror until it was just a building like any other building, glass and concrete entirely ordinary, holding its secrets the way all buildings did, which was not perfectly and not forever. The regional office was a nondescript 3-story building in an office park that looked like it sold insurance or processed health claims or performed some other function so ordinary it never occurred to anyone to look at it twice, which was, she understood, the point. A woman met them in the lobby. Late 30s, civilian clothes, the specific quality of stillness that came from a certain kind of training. She introduced herself as Agent Diane Rice, DoD Office of Inspector General, and she shook Nora's hand and didn't look at the chair. "Thank you for coming," she said. "We know this wasn't a simple decision." "I have a case number," Nora said, "and a notebook." Rice looked at her with an expression that had something genuine in it, not warm exactly, but real. "We know. Fitch is conscious and stable. He asked us this morning if the nurse made it out of the building." Something moved through Nora that she didn't have an immediate name for. She filed it away. "He told his cardiologist," Rice continued, "that he needs to speak with investigators, that he has been trying to for 3 months and something kept getting in the way." She paused. "We think we know what or who." She led them to a conference room on the second floor. It was not the kind of conference room that had catered setups or placards with names. It had a table and chairs and a window with the blinds half drawn and a whiteboard with things on it that Nora didn't look at directly because they hadn't invited her to look. Rice set a recorder on the table. Beside her, a second agent, male, early 50s, faced like someone who had been skeptical about everything for a long time and had found it professionally useful, opened a folder. "Before we start," the second agent said, "I need to confirm your background. Former Army, 68 Whiskey, 2 deployments." "Yes." "Combat tours?" "Yes." He looked at her for a moment, then he looked at the folder and then back at her, and his expression did the thing Marcus's had done in the cafeteria on day 1, the recalibration, the reading of what he'd been looking at without fully seeing. "There's something you should know," Rice said, "before we get into the details of the case." She exchanged a look with the other agent. "Your service record, the complete record, was not in the system that Mercer Valley Medical Center accessed when they hired you. What they saw was a partial record. It's been that way since your discharge processing." Nora went still. "Administrative error," Rice said, and the way she said it communicated clearly that she did not believe it was an error. "The full record includes commendations that didn't make it into the version your employer saw. Decorations. An assessment from your commanding officer at the time of your medical discharge that describes you." She glanced at the folder. As one of the most capable combat medics he'd encountered in 22 years of service. The room was very quiet. "Why are you telling me this now?" Nora said. Rice looked at her steadily. "Because in approximately 2 hours, Harlan Callum is going to receive a notification from the State Licensing Board that a formal complaint has been filed against your credentials. He filed it this morning." She paused. "And we want you to know, before that happens, that we have been aware of your background for longer than you might expect, and that awareness is relevant to what happens next." The second agent leaned forward. "Ms. Kelsey, Captain Kelsey." He said the rank carefully, deliberately, watching her face. "We need to ask you about what Gerald Fitch said in that room. All of it, and then we need to talk about what you're willing to do." Outside, the Colorado sky was flat and very blue and entirely indifferent to what was happening in a nondescript office park 20 minutes from a hospital that was, at this moment, preparing to dismantle the career of a woman who had just become the most important witness in a 3-year federal investigation. Her notebook was on the table in front of Agent Rice. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't look at it. Then Rice's phone buzzed, and the second agent's. In the same second, both of them, exactly the same second, and Rice looked at her screen and something in her face changed completely. "Excuse us," she said. She stood. The second agent was already standing. They moved toward the door with a speed that was controlled but absolute. "What happened?" Nora said. Rice paused at the door. She turned back. Her face had the quality of someone managing information in real time, deciding what to give out and in what order. "Gerald Fitch," she said. "He's gone." Nora's chest went cold. He coded, "No." Rice's voice was very precise. "He's gone. He checked out of cardiology 40 minutes ago, against medical advice. His room is empty and his phone is off and nobody saw him leave." She looked at Nora directly, "Which means someone did." The door closed. The room held its silence.
And somewhere in the city, in a hospital that had just suspended her, and a building that had just received her, and a network that was moving faster than anyone had anticipated, the thread that Gerald Fitch had pressed into her hand on a conference room floor was the only thing connecting all of it, and Nora Kelsey was the only person holding it. Rice was back in 4 minutes, not the controlled re-entry of someone who had managed the information and was ready to present it. She came through the door moving, which told Nora that whatever had been managed in the hallway had not resolved cleanly.
The second agent, she'd caught his name now, Brandt, was on his phone in the doorway, not entering. His conversation was low and rapid, and she couldn't hear the words, but she could read the posture, and the posture said the situation had become more complicated in a very specific direction. "He didn't leave on his own," Rice said. She sat down. She put her phone face up on the table, which meant she was expecting it to move again. Security footage from the cardiology corridor shows 2 men in scrubs entering his room at approximately 9:40 this morning. They were in there 4 minutes. When they left, Fitch was with them. He was walking, not being carried, but his face... She paused. "Our analyst says the expression is consistent with coercion." Nora absorbed this. He went because they told him what would happen if he didn't. "That's our read." Rice looked at her directly. "Which means someone with access to the hospital's internal schedule knew he was there. Knew which floor, which room." She paused. "The admission was not in the general system. It was in the Federal Contract Patient Network, separate access credentials." "Who has access to that network?" "At Mercer Valley, the medical director, the Federal Contract Coordinator, and IT administration." Rice's voice was very flat. "We're looking at all three." Nora thought about Gerald Fitch's room number. She thought about the specific geography of Mercer Valley's cardiology ward, East Wing, second floor, same floor as the federal contract beds. She thought about the morning she'd spent going through the mental logistics of Callum's position and the specific kind of intelligence that looked slow and landed fast. He hadn't just filed the licensing complaint this morning. He'd made other calls. "He knew I was here?" she said. Rice's expression didn't change, but something behind it tightened. "We're operating on that assumption, yes." "How?" "We don't know yet." Brandt came through the door and sat, phone still in hand. "Our location security is solid, but Callum has been running the federal contract relationship at Mercer Valley for 6 years. That means he has contacts, favors, informal networks." He said it with the flatness of someone who had been surprised by what informal networks could accomplish too many times to be surprised anymore. "We're backtracking the communication chain." Nora looked at the notebook on the table between them. Then she looked at Rice. "What do you need from me right now?" It wasn't a question. Rice heard that. "Everything you remember from that room," Rice said. "Not just the number. Everything he said, in order, as close to verbatim as you can manage. And then I want you to walk me through your interactions with Callum. Every conversation, every document request, everything that happened after the conference suite incident." She had a legal pad in front of her. "We have the case file. We have 3 years of documentation. What we've been missing is someone who was in the room." Nora put her hands on the table. She thought about the specific discipline of memory she'd developed in the field, not because she was extraordinary at it, but because in a forward operating base with casualties incoming and incomplete information and people making decisions in real time, the alternative to accurate recall was someone dying from the wrong medication or the wrong intervention or the wrong assessment of what was happening to a body. She had trained the skill the way you train any skill, out of necessity, over and over, until it was just how she thought. She started talking. It took 90 minutes, not because she was slow, because Rice was thorough in the way that investigators are thorough when they know that what they're building has to hold weight in a room where someone is going to push against it very hard. Brandt took notes. Rice listened and occasionally asked a question that was small and precise and hit exactly the pressure point of something Nora had said that needed more specificity. It wasn't adversarial, it was professional, and Nora found, to her own mild surprise, that she was comfortable with the professionalism. More comfortable than she'd expected to be, sitting in a room with federal investigators and her notebook and the knowledge that her clinical privileges were suspended and her medical director had filed a licensing complaint against her that morning. She'd been in harder rooms. She'd given information under worse conditions. The chair she was sitting in was not as uncomfortable as several she remembered. At 12:40, Rice set down her pen. "You documented everything in real time," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Field habit." "The notation system in the margins." Rice glanced at the notebook. "That's a medical shorthand. Combat medic shorthand. I've used it since training. It's faster." Nora paused. "If it needs to be decoded for the record, I can do that. We'll have it transcribed and you can review." Rice closed her own pad. "I want to talk about something else now." Nora waited. "Gerald Fitch," Rice said, "has been trying to get this information into federal hands for 3 months. During that time, 2 things happened that we believe were meant to stop him. The first was a private meeting with a legal representative connected to Callum's network 6 months ago that resulted in Fitch going silent. The second was Tuesday." She looked at Nora steadily. "Fitch came to Mercer Valley on Tuesday because the meeting was framed to him as a resolution, a negotiated exit from the contract relationship that would allow his company to survive regulatory scrutiny. He believed he was going there to close something out. Instead, he was being assessed," Nora said. "How compliant he was going to be." "That's what we think. And when he went down, when his heart did what it did, and you walked in, he made a decision in real time that the case number was more valuable in your hands than in that room." Rice paused. "He knew your name." Nora looked at her. "He didn't know you personally," Rice said, "but Callum has been building a file on you for 6 months. Attempts to suppress, discredit, transfer. The file exists in the hospital's administrative network, and Fitch had access to the network through his contractor credentials." She held Nora's gaze. "He read the file. He knew what Callum had been doing to you. And when a nurse in a wheelchair walked into that room and stabilized his heart and looked him in the eye and didn't flinch, he decided you were the one." The room was very quiet. Brant's phone moved on the table. He looked at it. His expression did something. "They found him," he said. Rice turned. "Fitch. He's at a private medical clinic 23 miles east. He walked in 40 minutes ago and identified himself to the staff by his full legal name." Brant was already standing. "He's asking for federal investigators." Rice was up in one motion. She looked at Nora. "We need to go. You should come." "Why me?" "Because he asked for you specifically." Rice picked up the notebook and her pad. "He said..." She glanced at the phone. "He said the nurse with the wheels." His words. The clinic was a small independent facility outside the city grid, the kind that served rural patients and kept minimal staff and had the particular quietness of a building that had learned not to attract attention. A local sheriff's unit was already in the parking lot when they arrived. 2 vehicles, deputies keeping a perimeter at a distance that suggested they understood this was not their jurisdiction, but wanted to be useful anyway. Gerald Fitch was in an examination room in the back. He looked worse than he had on the conference suite floor, which was a specific kind of worse. The worse of someone who had been running on adrenaline and had now stopped running and was facing the bill for it. His color was bad. His jacket was gone and his shirt was untucked, and he had an IV line in his left arm that the clinic staff had started when he walked in. He was sitting up on the examination table with the deliberateness of someone who had decided to stay upright through sheer intention. He looked at Nora when she came through the door, and something in his face moved. Not relief exactly, but the thing that comes after a long time of being uncertain whether a decision you made was right. "You're in one piece," he said. "So are you," she said. "Barely." He almost laughed. It came out as something shorter. "They told me you'd been suspended." "This morning, yes." "I'm sorry for that." He said it with the plainness of a man who was not accustomed to apologizing and was doing it anyway. "What I gave you in that room, I didn't plan it. I want you to know that. But when I saw you..." He stopped, pressed his mouth together. "I'd read what Callum did to you, the transfer to intake, the blocked appointments, the file he kept." He shook his head. "I know what that looks like. It's the same thing he did to the contract staff when they started asking the wrong questions about the supply invoices." Reese moved to the side of the room and let them have a moment, which Nora noticed and was grateful for. "Tell me what happened this morning," Nora said. "2 men came to my room." His jaw worked. "They were calm about it. That's what gets me. They were completely calm. told me there was a vehicle waiting and that if I came quietly, the situation with my company could still be resolved without criminal referral. He looked at his hands. I know what that means. It means the opposite. It means they were going to make sure I disappeared into a process that took years and went nowhere. But you didn't stay with them. We were in the parking garage. I told them I needed a minute. I walked to the stairwell and I didn't stop. He looked up. I'm 63 years old and I haven't run in 15 years, and I ran 6 blocks to a cab. For a moment, neither of them said anything. I should have done this 3 months ago, he said. You're doing it now. My attorney, the one connected to Callum's network, he told me the investigators didn't have enough, that the case would collapse, that the safest thing was to withdraw cooperation and wait it out. Fitch looked at Rice across the room. Was that true? Rice said it carefully. The case had gaps. It needed a witness inside the transaction chain. And now? Now, Rice said, we need your formal statement, and we need it today. Fitch looked back at Nora. He had the look of someone who had done something for a long time that they understood, in retrospect, was wrong, and were trying to figure out where the honest accounting of that sat. She didn't help him with it. That was his work, not hers. The supply chain fraud, he said. My company was the billing entity, but I wasn't running the scheme. I want that on record. He held her gaze. I signed things I shouldn't have signed because I was told the invoices reflected legitimate adjustments, and I didn't look hard enough at whether that was true. When I finally looked, he stopped. Callum ran it. The approvals went through the federal contract coordinator at Mercer Valley, a man named Stoltz, and they went through Callum. The money didn't go to my company. It went to a shell entity that Callum controls. The room was very still. Brant was writing. Rice had her recorder out. I can give you the account structures, Fitch said. The entity names, the approval chain, everything. He exhaled. I have documents. I've had them for 8 months. They're in a storage facility in the city. I can give you the access code. We'll need someone with you, Brant said. I know that. Rice looked at Nora. There was something in the look, not a question, but a recognition. You should hear this part too, she said. All of it. Nora stayed. What? They were there for 3 hours. What Gerald Fitch described was not complicated in concept, only in execution. The federal contract beds at Mercer Valley were funded through a specific allocation that covered equipment, supplies, and operational costs for a designated patient population, predominantly veterans from the regional VA referral network. The allocation was audited annually, but the audit process ran through the hospital's own administrative reporting structure, which meant that Callum, as medical director, controlled what the auditors saw. Over 3 years, he had approved procurement invoices from Fitch's company for equipment and supplies that had been ordered but significantly over-invoiced. The difference between what was actually delivered and what was billed flowing through a cascade of shell transactions into an account that Callum had structured through a law firm in another state. The amounts were large, not catastrophically large in any single transaction, but consistently large, and 3 years of consistent had become something that the investigators, once they had the structure Fitch provided, could trace in both directions. Stoltz, the federal contract coordinator, had handled the paperwork. Callum had handled the approvals. Fitch's company had been the face on the transactions, which was why Fitch had been the one fielding the federal investigators' initial questions, and why Callum had needed Fitch quiet. How much did Callum clear? Brant asked. Fitch said a number. Brant stopped writing for a full second. Nora watched Rice's face do the thing faces do when information confirms something you already suspected was large and turns out to be larger than large. That's over 3 years, Fitch said. The annual allocations for the federal contract beds aren't public, so the variance wasn't visible from outside the hospital's internal reporting. But visible from inside, Rice said. If you were looking. He paused. Nobody was looking. Not until your office opened the case. Rice made a note. She looked at Nora across the table. And the file Callum kept on you, she said. The internal documentation of the attempts to suppress your advancement, the transfer to outpatient intake, the licensing complaint this morning. She said it carefully.
We believe that was partly administrative cover, making sure that if you ever became a problem, there was a paper trail that made you look unreliable. A disabled nurse with performance issues is easier to dismiss than a decorated combat medic who walked into a room and saved a federal witness. The words hit the air and sat there. Nora had known the shape of it. Hearing the words was different from knowing the shape. "He didn't know I knew anything," she said. "He just knew I'd been in the room." "He knew you'd been in the room with Fitch. He didn't know what Fitch had said."
But he couldn't risk it. Rice paused. The licensing complaint this morning, that was meant to move you out of any position where you could be a credible witness. Suspended nurses pending licensing review don't make compelling testimonials. How long before the complaint process? We're going to move faster than the complaint process, Rice said. It was the first time she'd said anything that sounded like a direct commitment rather than a procedural observation, and it landed accordingly. They left the clinic at 4 in the afternoon with Fitch's formal statement, his access code, and 3 hours of recorded testimony that Brandt described in the parking lot as the cleanest primary witness account he'd heard in 11 years. Marcus was leaning against his truck where they'd left it. He'd waited the entire 3 hours. Bravo was out of the vehicle sitting beside him, doing the 4-directional attention sweep that working dogs did in open spaces, not anxious, just aware. He looked at Nora's face when she came out and read it accurately. "It's real," he said. "It's real." "How bad?" "Bad enough." She looked at him. "Callum ran the whole thing, 3 years. The federal contract beds were the mechanism." She paused. The veterans coming through the VA referral network, they were receiving care, but the supply and equipment allocations for their care were being systematically defrauded. Something moved through Marcus's face that was not the controlled professional affect she was used to seeing. It was faster than that and rawer, and she understood it, understood exactly where it came from, which was the particular kind of fury that belongs to people who have sent or watched others be sent into situations where they had to trust the system, and have then discovered that the system was a vehicle for someone's financial gain. He pressed it down. She watched him do it, the physical compression of it, jaw tightening and then releasing. "What happens now?" "They move on Callum tonight." Rice, coming up beside Nora, had answered before she could. "The storage facility first. Once we have the documents, the physical account records, and the approval chain documentation, we have enough for a federal warrant." She looked at Marcus. "Mr. Hale, we may need you as well, as a witness to the events in the hospital over the past 2 weeks, your interactions with Ms. Kelsey, what you observed." "Yes," Marcus said. He said it without hesitation. The way he'd said things in the hospital corridor when there was only one clear answer and he'd already worked out what it was. "Whatever you need." Bravo moved to Nora and pressed himself against her chair, the same weight she'd felt in the cafeteria. She put her hand on his back. "Oh." They took her statement at the regional office at 6:15. After that, there was nothing to do but wait, which was its own particular discipline. She sat in the small conference room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in her notebook, which Rice had returned after photographing every page. And she thought about Gerald Fitch in the clinic with the IV in his arm and the face of a man doing the accounting of a long series of choices. She thought about Callum in his office at Mercer Valley, or wherever he was right now, with his careful expressions and his calculated silences and the file he had built against her over 6 months, the specific work of a man who had looked at a nurse in a wheelchair and decided she was something to be managed rather than something to be reckoned with. The call came at 8:47. Reese came back into the conference room, and her face had a different quality than it had had all day. Not relaxed, because Rice didn't appear to do relaxed, but resolved. The difference between the face of someone managing an open problem and the face of someone managing a problem that has just moved into a different phase. "The storage facility," she said. "The documents are exactly what Fitch described. Account structures, approval chains, transaction records going back 34 months. She paused. "The warrant has been authorized. Federal marshals are at Harlan Callum's residence right now." Nora didn't say anything. "Stoltz was picked up at the hospital 20 minutes ago. Compliance office. He was apparently in the middle of shredding documents when the marshals arrived." Rice's voice was very even. "He stopped when they showed him the warrant." "The licensing complaint Callum filed this morning," Nora said. That's going to be a different kind of conversation. Reese sat down. She looked at Nora directly. The full complaint process is now in the context of a federal fraud investigation in which Callum is a primary subject. The licensing board will be notified of that context. She paused. It doesn't automatically resolve everything. There's process. But the grounds for the complaint have been substantially compromised by the fact that they were filed by a man who was simultaneously orchestrating a federal crime. Nora turned this over. And my clinical privileges. A suspension issued by a medical director who is now a federal fraud suspect. Rice held her gaze. We'll be in contact with Mercer Valley's Board of Trustees in the morning. The administrative actions taken against you in the past 24 hours and over the past 14 months are going to be reviewed in that context. She paused. I want to be honest with you. Process takes time. This won't be resolved tomorrow, but the trajectory... She stopped. The trajectory has changed, Nora said. Yes. Rice looked at her steadily. Captain Kelsey, the trajectory has changed. It did. Marcus drove her home at 10. They didn't talk much. Bravo was settled in the back seat and the city moved past the windows in its ordinary late evening configuration. Streetlights, the ghost-lit windows of office buildings, the specific sparseness of streets after 9 on a weekday. She watched it and thought about nothing in particular, which was what she did when she was processing something that was too large to think about directly. At a red light, Marcus said, "You okay?" She considered it. "I don't know yet." "Fair? Are you?" He thought about it with the same seriousness she'd applied to the question. Bravo knew something was coming before I did. 3 weeks ago, in the cafeteria. He glanced in the mirror at the dog, who was watching the road with the calm attention of something that had been right about things before and knew it. I'm getting better at trusting that. She looked at him. That's a different answer than okay. Yeah. He said it without apology. I know. The light changed. The truck moved. At her building, she transferred to her chair with the practiced efficiency she'd been doing for 4 years. And Marcus stood by the truck with his hands in his pockets and didn't hover, which she'd noticed he was good at, being present without converting presence into pressure. Tomorrow, she said. They said they'd be in contact with the board in the morning. I know. It'll be messy. It usually is. He looked at her. You've been doing difficult things in messy situations for a long time. The chair's different. The rest isn't. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went inside. Yep, she did not sleep well, but she slept. She woke at 5:43 to a message from Rice. Callum taken into federal custody at 11:18 p.m. last night. Appearance scheduled this morning. Media likely. Be aware. She read it twice. Then she got up and made coffee and sat by the window in the early morning dark and thought about the South Conference suite at Mercer Valley, the catered table, the placards with names, the man on the floor who had pressed 7 digits into the noise of his own emergency, and about what the gap between what Harlan Callum had thought she was and what she had actually been had cost, and how long it had been costing, and what it was going to take to close it. Her phone moved again, a number she didn't recognize, which had stopped bothering her last night and had started bothering her again now. She looked at the message. It was a photograph. The photograph was of a document, an administrative memorandum formatted in the specific header style of the federal contract program. She squinted at it. The date was 3 days ago. The document was addressed to the federal contract coordinator at Mercer Valley, which meant Stoltz, and it referenced the reallocation of the federal contract beds program to a new administrative structure. The new administrative structure named a consulting firm as the interim operational oversight entity. The consulting firm's registered agent was not Harlan Callum. It was a name she didn't recognize. But below the name, in the document's signature block, was a title she did recognize, because it was the same title that appeared on the placard she'd seen on the conference suite table on Tuesday morning, next to Gerald Fitch's company name. Someone else had been in that room on Tuesday. Someone who was not Callum, not Fitch, not any of the hospital staff she'd identified in her statement. Someone whose name had been on the placard, and whom she had not been asked about, because she hadn't thought to mention it, because the room had been full of people, and she'd been focused on the man going into arrhythmia on the floor. She stared at the photograph. Then she called Rice. It rang 4 times before Rice picked up, and when she did, her voice had the flat quality of someone who had either not slept or had been awake for hours managing something that hadn't resolved. "I was about to call you," Rice said. "The memorandum," Nora said. A pause. "Where did you get that?" "Someone sent it. Unknown number, 10 minutes ago." A longer pause. "We found the same document in the storage facility last night. We've been working it since midnight." Rice's voice was very careful. "Callum was not the top of this, Kelsey. He was the operational layer. The entity in the memorandum, the consulting firm, it's the same structure that received the funds from the Shell account. Callum was moving money upward." She felt the shape of it change again, not smaller, but larger, and in a direction she hadn't anticipated. "Who's the registered agent?" she said. Rice said a name. Nora didn't know the name, but she recognized the second line of the signature block that Rice read out after it. The institutional affiliation, the title, the department. Federal. Not hospital. Not contractor. Federal. The fraud had not originated with Harlan Callum. He had been operating inside a structure that someone else had built. And that structure had people in it whose jurisdiction included the very investigation that was currently moving against them, which meant that the investigators had been investigating something that was, at least in part, also investigating itself. She sat in the early morning dark with her coffee and thought about Gerald Fitch running 6 blocks to a cab, and about 2 men in the parking garage who had been very calm, and about the text that had told her to leave the notebook. "They knew about your operation," she said. "We believe so," Rice said. "Yes. How long have you known?" "Since midnight." Rice paused. "I'm telling you now because you're a witness and because you deserve to know the situation you're in." Another pause. "And because the photograph you just received, we didn't send it." Nora looked at the unknown number on her screen. "Someone inside the structure is trying to help you," Rice said, "or trying to use you. We don't know which." The Colorado dawn was beginning to happen outside the window. Gray first, then the first thin line of something lighter at the edge of the mountains. The ordinary morning. The ordinary beginning of a day that was going to be neither ordinary nor, she suspected, a beginning. "Tell me what you need me to do," she said. Rice told her. And somewhere across the city, in an office that was not the nondescript building in the office park, and was not Mercer Valley Medical Center, and was connected to both of them by threads that 3 years of careful construction had kept invisible until last night. Someone who had not been named in any statement, who had not been in any room that Nora had been in, who had built the mechanism that Harlan Callum had operated inside, was looking at the same dawn and understanding that the nurse they had been so certain was too small to see had been looking directly at them the entire time. What Rice needed was simple in concept and complicated in everything else. The unknown number that had sent the photograph, Rice needed Nora to respond to it. Not with information, not with anything that could be used against her. Just a response that kept the line open, that signaled to whoever was on the other end that she had received the document and was willing to receive more. The theory was straightforward. Someone inside the structure was fracturing. Structures under pressure fracture from the inside, Rice had said, and when they do, the person fracturing needs somewhere to go. Nora was, at this moment, the somewhere. She sent 3 words back to the unknown number. "I see it." Then she waited. The response came in 11 minutes. Another photograph. This one was not a memorandum. It was a screenshot of an internal communication thread, institutional header, timestamp, the specific formatting of a secure messaging system she didn't recognize. The conversation was between 2 parties identified only by initials. One set of initials appeared in the header of every federal contract communication she'd seen in Rice's files the night before. The thread was dated 4 days ago, 3 days before Callum's arrest. 1 day before Fitch had walked into Mercer Valley for the meeting that wasn't on the calendar. The conversation was 8 exchanges long. She photographed her screen with a second device, an old phone she'd had for years that she used for nothing, and she read it twice to make sure she had it, and then she called Rice. "Sending it now," she said. She heard Rice's end of the line go quiet in the particular way of someone reading something while still holding a phone. Then, "Stay where you are." Don't go to Mercer Valley. Don't go anywhere institutional. I'll call you in an hour. The hour was 53 minutes. What the thread showed, Rice explained carefully, was a decision. 4 days ago, when the DODOIG's investigation had moved close enough to Mercer Valley's specific records that someone inside the structure understood it was no longer containable, a decision had been made. Not to stop the investigation, stopping it was no longer possible, but to contain its upward reach, to let Callum be the ceiling. The thread documented the decision in the specific language of people who were careful enough not to say what they meant directly, but not careful enough, apparently, to avoid saying it in writing at all. The initials at the top of the thread belonged to a deputy director within a federal oversight office, an office that had, among its other functions, advisory access to the DODOIG's ongoing investigations, which was how they'd known about the case, which was how they'd known about Fitch's cooperation and when it had started, which was how they'd known to be afraid of it. The name beneath the initials when Rice's team ran the identifier was a man named Douglas Ray. Nora had never heard of him. She suspected that was precisely the point of Douglas Ray, that nobody had, and that being nobody anybody had heard of was the specific machinery by which someone like him stayed operational for as long as he had. He's been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, Rice said, as of 40 minutes ago. That was fast. The thread made it fast. A pause. The person who sent you those photographs? We think it's Fitch's internal legal contact. The attorney who told him 3 months ago that the case would collapse. We think he's been watching the structure since Callum was arrested and doing the math. He panicked. He made a calculation. Different from panic, functionally. Rice's voice was careful. He's retained independent counsel as of this morning. We expect a proffer agreement by end of week. Nora sat with this for a moment. The coffee in her mug had gone cold again. She'd been letting coffee go cold for the past 2 days, which was its own kind of measure. Douglas Ray? She said. What happens to him? Federal fraud, conspiracy, obstruction. He was receiving money from the same shell account structure as Callum. The amounts are different, significantly higher, because he was the entity providing cover for the operation, not running the operational layer. Rice paused. He will have the best attorneys available to him. This will take time, but the thread is documented, the account structures are documented, and Gerald Fitch is no longer the only witness. What does it mean for the case against Callum? Callum stays where he is. The federal charges stand independent of Ray. Another pause. He made his own choices. Ray being above him doesn't change what he did. She thought about Harlan Callum in federal custody. She thought about the South Conference suite and the corridor and the specific geometry of a room arranged to communicate hierarchy. She thought about the word restructuring applied to her career while he'd built his fraud in the walls around her. And my suspension, she said. The Board of Trustees at Mercer Valley has been notified of the full situation. The General Counsel's office contacted us at 7 this morning. Rice's voice shifted to something very deliberate. The administrative actions against you, the transfer to outpatient intake, the suspension of clinical privileges, the licensing complaint, all of them originated from Harlan Callum. In the context of a federal fraud investigation in which he is a primary defendant, those actions are being reviewed with the presumption that they were retaliatory in nature. The licensing board has agreed to hold the complaint pending the federal proceedings. A pause. The board is convening an emergency session this afternoon. Nora looked out the window. The mountains had cleared from the morning's thin light and were standing the way they always stood, old and indifferent and large. Rice, she said. Yeah. The veterans in the federal contract beds, the supply allocations that were defrauded for 3 years. She said it plainly. What happens to them? A beat. Rice seemed to register the shift in the question, away from Nora's situation entirely, towards something that had been underneath all of it the whole time. There will be a remediation process. The allocation irregularities will be audited and corrected. Whether any patient care was directly impacted, we don't know yet. That review is going to take time. I want to be part of that review. Rice was quiet for a moment. I'll note that. Note it clearly, Nora said. She went to Marcus's apartment at noon. Not because she needed company. She'd spent 14 months being sufficient company for herself. but because he deserved to hear it directly, and because Bravo deserved to be somewhere in the vicinity of good news for once. The dog met her at the door with the low sound that wasn't quite a greeting, pressing his nose to her hands and then stepping back with the satisfied quality of something that had confirmed a fact it already suspected. Marcus looked at her face the way he'd been looking at it for 3 weeks now, which was as if it were a situation report that he was reading for what it didn't say as much as what it did. "It's over," he said, "the immediate part. But it's over. Callum's in federal custody. Ray is on administrative leave with an investigation opening this morning. Fitch is safe and talking." She looked at him. "Your testimony is still going to be needed. Formal deposition, probably. Everything you witnessed in the hospital." "I know." He said it without hesitation, the same as the first time. "Whatever it takes." She came in and he made coffee. Actual good coffee, which was a significant improvement on the cold institutional version she'd been consuming for 2 days, and they sat at his kitchen table and Bravo arranged himself across the floor between them with the deliberate positioning of something that was off duty and knew it. "The VA referral network," Marcus said. He'd been thinking about it. She could see that he'd been thinking about it since the night before, the way he thought about things, quietly, in the back, until he was ready to say what he'd gotten to. The veterans coming through those federal contract beds, they were being used. Yes. The people supposed to be protecting the integrity of that program were running the fraud through it. Yes. His jaw did the thing it had done in the parking lot the day before. He pressed it down again. "Is there any mechanism to ensure it doesn't—" He stopped. "That's a stupid question. The mechanism failed. The mechanism can be rebuilt." She looked at him. "With different people in it. That's what mechanisms are." He looked at her for a moment. "You're going to push for that, aren't you?" "I'm already on record asking to be part of the remediation review." Something moved in his face. The complicated thing she'd been seeing develop over 3 weeks that sat between relief and respect and something that hadn't been named yet. "Of course you are. Someone has to." "Yeah." He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. "Someone does." The Mercer Valley Board of Trustees convened their emergency session at 2 in the afternoon. Nora was not in the room for the session, but she was in the building, in a small administrative waiting area on the second floor that she had never had occasion to be in before, because it was the kind of space reserved for conversations with the board, and she had never, in 14 months, been a person the board spoke to directly. The board's legal counsel came out at 3:40 and asked if she'd be willing to speak to the full board. She said yes. It was 9 people around a long table that had the particular formality of a room used for decisions. Some of them she recognized. Most she didn't. The board chair was a woman in her 60s named Margaret Osei, who had the quality of someone who had been making consequential decisions for a long time and had stopped being visibly uncertain about them. Osei looked at Nora when she came in, looked at her directly and completely, the chair included, with the specific attention of someone taking a full inventory of what they were seeing, not pity, not the assessing discomfort of someone working out what accommodation might be required. Just attention. "Thank you for coming," she said. "We have some things to tell you, and then I'd like to hear from you directly." What the board had to tell her took 20 minutes. The administrative actions against her, every one of them, back to the first blocked committee application 6 months into her tenure, were being formally reversed. The suspension of clinical privileges was lifted effective immediately. The licensing complaint would be formally withdrawn by the hospital's legal team within the hour. The transfer to outpatient intake had been nullified before it had taken effect. The board's legal counsel placed a document on the table in front of her that formalized each reversal with the specific precision of people who understood they were managing a liability and were choosing to manage it honestly rather than defensively, which was not always the same thing. "There's something else," Osei said. Nora looked up from the document. "The federal contract beds program is going to require new oversight structure. Independent of the medical director's office, that office is vacant, effective last night, and the selection process for a replacement will take time. In the interim, and as part of the board's response to the remediation requirements the federal investigators have outlined, we are proposing the creation of a trauma response and oversight division." Osei looked at her steadily. The division would coordinate care standards across the federal contract beds and the general medical floors,
with specific focus on veteran patient populations and medically complex cases. It would carry a clinical leadership designation. She paused. We would like to offer you the role. The room was very quiet. Nora looked at the table, not at the document, not at Osei, just at the table for a moment, because there are things that need a second of unwitnessed interior processing before you can respond to them in a room full of people. 14 months. The same corner table in the cafeteria, the appeals that went into drawers, the corridor outside Callum's office, and the word restructuring. The 4 years before that, in which she had rebuilt herself from the ground up. The physical therapy, the learning curve, the period she didn't talk about in which she'd had to decide whether the person she'd been before was gone entirely or was still in there somewhere, reorganized. She thought about Gerald Fitch's hand on her wrist. 3 words pressed into the noise of a deteriorating situation. She thought about Bravo's weight across her lap in a crowded cafeteria, certain and still. She thought about Marcus in the parking lot, jaw compressed, doing the math of what it meant when the people who were supposed to protect veterans had been stealing from them instead. Someone has to. Yes, she said. I'll take it. Osei's expression did something small and genuine. Good. The story did not stay inside the hospital. She hadn't expected it to, but the speed was something. By the following morning, the federal arrests were on the regional news. Medical director of Mercer Valley Medical Center taken into federal custody on fraud charges, which was accurate as far as it went, and did not go nearly as far as the full picture did. But that was how news worked, and the full picture would come out in court, over months, in the specific way that full pictures came out when there were enough witnesses and enough documentation. Douglas Ray's administrative leave became a federal investigation within 48 hours. His attorneys released a statement that said very little in a great many words. The statement did not acknowledge the shell account structure, or the thread, or the 3 years of decisions that had been made inside an oversight office that was supposed to prevent exactly what it had been facilitating. Gerald Fitch gave his formal deposition 4 days after the arrests. He was accompanied by new legal counsel, independent, explicitly unconnected to any entity involved in the proceedings, and his statement ran to 6 hours over 2 sessions. She learned this from Rice, not from the news, and she learned also that Fitch had asked whether his statement would be available to the remediation review that was being assembled. He wanted to make sure, Rice said, that the part about the veteran patient population was in the record as clearly as the financial fraud part. That both things were wrong. That one of them was personal in a way the other wasn't. She understood that. The week after the board's decision, she was back on the medical floor. Not as a floor nurse. As the interim clinical director of the new division, which had a name, Veterans and Complex Care Oversight, and a mandate that was broader than her previous role, and a set of problems that were going to take months to properly scope. She had a small office, which she found she used primarily as a place to leave things she needed to pick up later. She spent most of her time on the floors, in the rooms, with the patients, because that was where the information was, and because, as she had learned in the field, in the most direct possible way, information gathered in person was worth 10 times any version of it reported through a chain. Patricia Dowd passed her in the East Corridor on her 3rd day back. They had not spoken since the suspension. Dowd stopped and looked at her for a moment. The chair, the lanyard with the new designation on the badge, the general fact of Nora Kelsey being back and upright and in a role that had not existed a week ago. I should have said something, Dowd said, when the transfers started, when the blocks happened. She said it flatly, without excessive apology, just the statement itself. I saw it and I didn't say anything. Nora looked at her. Why not? He was the director. Yes. That's not a good enough answer. No, Nora agreed. It isn't. Dowd held her gaze for a moment. Then she said, You'll be good at this, and moved on down the corridor, and that was all there was of it, which was probably right. Marcus's formal deposition was scheduled for the 2nd week of October. In the weeks before it, he kept his weekly appointments with the behavioral health program on the 4th floor, which he had been doing since the day Bravo had sprinted through the cafeteria and everything that followed had followed. He talked about it the same way he talked about most things, with the precision of someone who had decided that honest accounting was worth the discomfort of the accounting,
even when the discomfort was significant. Bravo still detected before Marcus did. That had not changed and probably wouldn't. But Marcus had started saying, when it happened, he's reading something, which was different from the version of Marcus who had come through the cafeteria door 3 weeks ago trying to reclaim a leash and losing the thread. Naming it was different from being overtaken by it. That was small, but small was where it always started. She saw them on Tuesdays when his appointment was scheduled, and they had gotten into the habit of coffee afterward in the cafeteria, the same corner table she'd always used, which had quietly become a different kind of corner table, if a table can become a different kind of thing by accumulating associations that shift its meaning. Maybe it can't. She thought it probably could. One Tuesday, 3 weeks after her reinstatement, Marcus set his coffee down and said, "Rice called me." About the deposition? About the remediation review. He looked at her. They're building a civilian advisory panel. People with direct experience of the VA referral network, veterans, former medical staff from affected facilities. He paused. She asked if I'd be willing to participate. What did you say? I said I needed to think about it. She waited. I'm going to say yes, he said. I know. He looked at her. You knew before I did. Bravo knew before either of us, she said. We're just catching up. He almost laughed. The almost was enough. The formal recognition came 6 weeks after the arrests. The Veterans and Complex Care Oversight Division hosted what was officially described as an inaugural program presentation. A meeting with the board, the federal remediation team, a representative from the regional VA network, and a small group of staff. It was held in the hospital's main conference room, not the South Suite, which had been quietly reassigned to storage pending a purpose review, which was a very institutional way of acknowledging that some rooms carry things that have to be cleared before they can be used again. Nora presented the division's first quarter mandate, 37 minutes with documentation, with the specific precision she brought to everything she considered worth bringing it to. She talked about care coordination gaps in the federal contract beds program. She talked about the remediation audit timeline and the standards benchmarks the division was establishing. She talked about the veteran patient population not as a demographic category, but as individual people who had been promised a level of care and been delivered something less because someone had looked at the gap between the promise and the delivery and decided it was a revenue opportunity. She said that plainly. Nobody in the room looked away. When she finished, Margaret Osei stood up. She didn't give a speech. She wasn't a speech person. Nora had figured that out in their first meeting, and it had been one of the things she'd found most reassuring about her. Osei stood up and said, "Thank you," with the specific weight of someone who meant it as more than courtesy. And then the room did something that Nora had not anticipated and that she did not know how to prepare for, which was that it stood up. Not all at once. It was not the choreographed rising of something scripted. It was a few people, and then more. And then it was the whole room. And the applause was not the polite kind that fills an institutional obligation. It was the kind that comes from people who have been sitting with something difficult and are releasing it, which is a different sound entirely. She held the edge of the table with one hand. She wasn't sure why. She didn't need to. She thought about the cafeteria 14 months ago, the corner table, the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned to perform the mechanics of daily routine without inviting attention. The particular yellow of institutional lighting, the feeling, which she had not named to herself but had been living inside, of being a person whom the system had decided had a certain ceiling, and of having accepted, not agreed with, but accepted, which is different, that the ceiling existed. She thought about the forward operating base, the casualties coming in on whatever transport was available, the decisions made in real time with incomplete information by a 26-year-old combat medic who had been trained to the edge of her capacity and had discovered in the field that the edge was further than training had suggested. She thought about the second tour and the way it had ended, the specific inventory she'd had to take of herself afterward, what was still there, what had changed, what had been permanently altered in ways she'd had to learn to navigate rather than reverse. She had spent 4 years learning to navigate. She had become very good at it. She was not a person who had overcome her circumstances in the cinematic way, cleanly, completely, with a moment of triumphant clarity that resolved the accounting. She was a person who had kept working inside circumstances that were difficult, who had made choices that were costly, who had gotten things wrong and corrected them and gotten other things wrong and corrected those too. She was a person who had been underestimated so consistently that she had started to develop a professional relationship with being underestimated, to use it, to operate within it the way you operate within a constraint, turning the constraint into something functional. And she was a person who was sitting in a conference room at Mercer Valley Medical Center while people stood up for her, and she was not certain what to do with that, which was fine. You didn't have to be certain what to do with something to let it happen. She let it happen. Afterward, in the corridor outside the conference room, Marcus was waiting with Bravo. He'd been at the back of the room during the presentation, she'd seen him when she'd started, and had made the deliberate decision not to look at him again until she was done, because looking at him would have made it harder to be as precise as she needed to be, and precision had been more important than the comfort of a familiar face. Now she looked at him. "They finally see who you are," he said. It was a simple thing to say. It was probably the right thing. She looked at Bravo, who was watching her with the calm of something that had never had any confusion about what she was, and had acted accordingly from the very beginning. The dog had known, in the cafeteria, before she had known herself what was about to unfold. He had positioned himself with the certainty of something that read situations not through the filter of expectation or assumption or the accumulated weight of what people were supposed to be, but through what was actually in the room. There was a lesson in that. She turned it over and thought that there probably always had been. "I have a meeting with the VA regional coordinator in an hour," she said. "Of course you do. The remediation audit scope isn't Kelsey." His voice was quiet and direct. "Take 1 hour." She looked at him. "Just one," he said. "Then go fix everything." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, 1 hour. They went to the cafeteria, the corner table, the institutional yellow, the coffee that was never quite right but was always available. And Bravo settled across the foot of her chair with the satisfied weight of something that had worked very hard and was ready to rest. And outside the window, the Colorado afternoon was doing what Colorado afternoons did in October, which was turning the light the color of things that were worth keeping. She was 32 years old. She had been a soldier. She had been injured. She had been dismissed, transferred, suspended, and threatened. She had been looked at and not seen, and then looked at and seen, and had discovered in the distance between those two experiences that she had never actually needed anyone to see her in order to be what she was. She had always been what she was. That was the thing nobody had taken from her. Not Callum, not the administrative machinery, not the 14 months of institutional friction or the 4 years before it of learning to rebuild inside a life that had been structurally altered. The injury had changed what she could do with her body. It had not changed what she could do with everything else, and everything else had turned out to be most of it. She knew this was not a universal truth. She knew that other people, in other situations, lost more than she had and did not get back what she got back. And that the mechanisms that had tried to suppress her had suppressed others who hadn't had a dog run into a cafeteria, and a veteran willing to testify, and a federal investigator willing to pick up the phone. She was not the universal version of this story. She was just the specific version. But specific versions were the only real ones. She drank her coffee. It was still not quite right. She was going to fix the procurement audit scope and improve the care coordination framework for the veteran patient population and build the oversight structure that should have existed 3 years ago. And none of that would be easy or clean or free of the kind of friction that made you want to put your head down on a desk at 3 in the afternoon and just breathe for a minute. She was going to do all of it anyway, because the chair had changed the geometry. It had not changed the medic, and the medic had always been the part that mattered. She finished her coffee. She had a meeting in an hour. She went to it.